Hi, everybody, and welcome to the Figma for EDU monthly workshop. My name is Miggy. I'm joined by Joanna. We're going to get started because there's a lot to cover today. This workshop is going to be resizing with auto layout and grid in Figma. The reason that I am centering the concept of resizing, this is going to lend itself to thinking about responsive content. So if you're designing things for the web, if you are designing things for multiple devices, you need to consider how objects resize. Folks have a difficult time with auto layout. Folks have a difficult time with grid. And I don't think it's specifically auto layout or grid, but it might be not understanding the difference between resizing, scaling, as well as just kind of the relationships of things. So it's all about intent. So really quickly, what auto layout does is it gives you the opportunity to stack things together. So as they grow or shrink, you don't have to move an entire layout. So previously, if I was to want to, let's say I wanted to add additional menu items here, right? I have this whole layout. If I was to add like an additional, like object here without auto layout, I'd have to move everything all the way down. But with auto layout, it understands that that container can grow and other content can also grow to fit the needs of that layout. So it used to be back in my day when we were designing, we would have to then move everything down. You wanted to add one more row and you have a lot of rows afterwards, it could create issues and problems in your design. So the reason auto layout exists is to make a lot of that process easier. Now you'll notice there's kind of like global auto layout and then there's kind of like micro auto layout. Auto layout gets nested, gets placed into components that can be reused. And I think that that level of complexity can also drive some misunderstandings. All right. So here, let's talk about resizing versus scaling in Figma. So here, the first thing that I want to highlight is that a lot of people conflate resizing with scaling. So when I resize a frame, what I'm doing is I'm actually resizing it much like I would a window. Now, if I scale things, I want things to get larger. So once again, scale mode is the mode that you want to do. So if I wanted to scale this, make this larger, if I go to make this bigger, it doesn't work. If I press the K key, so if I press K, it's also located down here. That's the scale tool. The scale tool on an object gives me the opportunity to make this larger. And you'll see down here in the bottom right, it tells me what the current width is, what the height is, and the anchor point by which I'm scaling an object. So if I want to scale it from the bottom right, as I increase that width, you'll see it grow from the bottom right. So the concept of scaling is one that's specific to Figma. And if that is your intent, right, so you either press the K key or you come down here to the left. Now, resizing is going to be a little bit different. And you might oftentimes realize you're like, I'm resizing this window, but this pineapple text and this pineapple image, they're not reacting or responding the way that I want. And that's where this concept of constraints come into play, right? So before auto layout even existed in Figma, we had this concept known as constraints. Constraints is your instructions to the layout that you're working with right here that helps the objects inside of a frame know what to do. So this first frame here, so right now we're in the constraints area. This first frame here, I set it up. You'll see I have a layer that has an image. You'll see I have a shape that is semi-transparent, and I have some text. Those three things are inside of the frame. Now, with no constraints, when I go to resize it, nothing currently happens. With constraints, though, right? The constraints on this pineapple image, on this background, and on this text, when I resize this, right, I'm not scaling it. When I'm resizing it, I'm instructing the objects inside how to behave. So I'm telling this image to resize along on the width, I'm sorry, on the left side and the right side, on the top and the bottom, right? I'm instructing it how to resize. That text, I'm telling it to be at the bottom. So when I select that image, now notice that the image is inside of a frame. It needs something to constrain to. So it's constraining to that outer frame. When I select the image inside of the frame, I come over here to the right to the constraints panel. If you don't see it, there's a little toggle over here on the right-hand side. Let me make my window a little bit bigger there. There we go. You can see that panel comes in, and that's the constraints panel. This constraints panel will, and if you don't see the word constraints, I'm going to highlight for y'all right here, since this is a education-focused audience. I'm going to click on this zoom, and over here, I can choose property labels. If I turn that off, I don't have insight into all of those fields. I don't know what they mean, especially if I'm new. When I click here and I go to property labels, now I can see them and I can confidently say that I'm working with my constraints here. With that image selected, I can set these constraints. By default, they're going to top left, and you'll notice this little blue dashed line, right? So right here, you'll see a little blue dashed line. It tells you on the canvas what those constraints are. So instead, what I want is I want this pineapple. Let's say if I center the constraints, I can click right here in the middle. I could set them here on the left. If I have center constraints, it instructs the pineapple when I resize this frame to go to the center, right? Now, if instead I say go to the right in the bottom, when I resize that, this is going to go to the right in the bottom. Now, this concept of constraints, I know you're probably thinking, I thought we were talking about auto layout. You have to understand these basic properties first. Then when you start working with auto layout, you'll much better understand how alignment works and the intention of what it is that you're trying to create. So here now, what I can do, this pineapple, right? This image, I drop it in there, I snap it, it sticks to the middle. And over here, let's say I want it to constrain to the left and right and the top and bottom. What that's going to do is then have it basically resize to that window. Now I could do that same thing with this image here, and I'll show you a shortcut. Instead of having to go to the drop down, I'm going to hold down the shift key. The shift key on my keyboard will then let me set this to left and right. So I can click here on the bottom. So clicking on one of those constraints will just set it. But if I press shift and click, it will acknowledge both top and bottom. So I just want this to be on the bottom and the left and right. And then you'll notice that this will follow suit. Now, if I want this text to also acknowledge the constraints, I want the text to be on the bottom. And then let's say right now, I'm just going to leave it like left, and it will now resize in the way that I expect it to. So much of what resizing is going to be in Figma, once again, you want to think about it as resizing your browser, right? When you resize your browser window, the whole thing doesn't scale up, it doesn't scale down. It moves and it adjusts how objects inside of that frame move along with it, right? So let's next talk about media, right? Images, text. We need to consider how are they going to resize as well. Once again, not necessarily considering scale. By the way, if you do want something to scale, I forgot one thing with constraints. If you do want constraints to scale, let me duplicate this. I'm going to hold down the Option key, Alt key on Windows. I'm going to move that down. I have a duplicate. I can also set everything here to have scale constraints. So scale is a behavior that I can then apply to everything that I'm working with. And if I go to scale this, right, it's going to do its best to scale. Now you'll notice the text isn't scaling because the text size is kind of like a finite thing. So you need to kind of be comfortable and familiar with how those things are going to work. Now, let's talk about images and text resizing. You'll notice that when I was resizing this image, the image is doing its best to fill that space, right? However, some of the ancillary areas are kind of getting cropped off. There's different fill modes for images, and it impacts how they show up when they resize. Right here, when I'm considering the fill modes of an image, right? When I click on this image and you click an image within the fill menu in the property panel on the right, you're going to notice these options. So fit, fill, fit, crop, and tile. Now, what fit is going to do, it's going to take the original image itself and it's going to do its best to always fit the image inside of the area provided to you by the shape that it is filling. So what you're going to do is you're going to end up with this transparent area outside of that space. So whereas fill is going to basically essentially cut out areas from that image, this one is attempting to fill it within that space. Then you're going to have crop. Crop is going to be a bit different. When you double click while holding down the option key or the alt key, you can bring up crop mode. This is going to give you the ability to control how you crop that image very specifically. However, if you go to resize an image, it's going to stretch that image, right? It's going to do things that you don't necessarily want as a desired output. And you might be thinking, well, then crop seems useless when resizing. This is when you need to think here that we also have this option for aspect ratio lock. What aspect ratio lock does is it constrains the width and the height together. So if I were to crop this image and aspect ratio lock is turned on, whenever I scale the image, it's always going to keep the width and the height in lockstep. So if you're going to be cropping your images, if you're thinking about resizing the images and maintaining the aspect ratio, that's one feature you want turned on. And so that's what's going to keep those dimensions in lockstep. Next up, tile. Tile's a little bit more fun. If you have like a patterned tile that you want to work with, it also helps understand how tile works. We also have a pattern feature in within Figma as well. So you can choose a pattern to essentially kind of like work with here. So let's say if I had like a little circle illustration here. So let's say I have a little circle and I want that to be the pattern. I can choose pattern. Oh, sorry, I did that again. I can go to pattern. I can select the source. I did it backwards. Let's do that right. Okay. I want the fill right here, select source. I want it to be the dots. There we go. So that's another way to make a pattern that gives you just a little bit more control than just the image tile. So just wanted to highlight there. That's a fun one that you can kind of work with. Check out some of my draw workshops to find out more about patterning. So we think about images. The recommendations that I'm going to have here are to crop with aspect ratio lock enabled, that you'll see that over there under layout, as well as work within fill, right? Those are going to be my two recommended options that you're working with. Always be mindful of the type of fill that you're working with. You can always just double click while holding down the option key on an image to adjust those fills really quick as a shortcut, as opposed to having to click over here and then going there. If you just option double click, it's going to set it to crop and then you can readjust it to fill. Fit would be useful if it's really the imperative is showing that entire image. So right now, this is a fill on that square. I can add another fill. Let's make that entirely black. and I can drop that down. So if you think about, you're going to have a bunch of different images here, like on a roving cast, and you always want to make sure you're showing the whole image, you can have that blackout area that sits behind it. So I've applied 2 fills here, but it could also just be anything that sits behind that as well. Think about in social media when you have an image that doesn't quite fit in the space, but you want to show the whole image, that's going to be the best option for applying fit. So great question. So here we want to also think about height, width, and fixed sizing for text. So whenever you draw in a text field, a lot of people don't pay attention to how the resizing of the text field works. When I select the text field, we have auto width, which is just usually a single line that you could put line breaks in, but basically it's the width is determined by the text inside of it. And this concept is going to be really important when you start thinking about auto layout, right? So the shape of the container is dependent on the width. There's going to be different ways to control these. So if I have, by default, I have this auto height, right? So what auto height means is that as I'm typing in more text, the bounds of that text field grows with the text, right? So if you think about it, that in and of itself is a way that we need to think about auto layout. So as the text grows, it impacts the height of that box. So it's an important concept to hold a mental model for. If I were to drag that text field down, I no longer am set to auto height. I'm now set to a fixed size. And that means that it is possible for my text field to, my text to grow beyond that height. And that height is not going to be captured, right? So more often than not, you're going to want auto height. And instead of having to move your mouse all the way over here to set it, you can just double click the bottom. So double clicking the right will set it to auto width. Let me hit undo. And double clicking, if it's set fixed here, we'll set that to auto height. So auto height, double click the bottom of the fixed text field, auto width, double click the right edge of an auto height text field, and fixed, you can just drag whatever size you want. And then that fixed value means that you determine the height and the width of that text field. More often than not, though, you want it set to auto height and you want to control that width. Now, once again, that concept is going to take us into auto layout. Auto layout essentially allows your objects to kind of sit together, right? So if we take a look at some sit together, kind of always positioned in like a series. So here, you'll notice that this is an extract from that interface that I showed you in the beginning. And what we have here is we have a list of them, right? This is setting those objects in a vertical list. One cool thing about auto layout is it then allows me to reorganize that in a manner that is much more interactive and intuitive. I can select this object. When I select this frame, I can see that auto layout is enabled. It is currently using a vertical auto layout stack. The gap between them is controlled with this value right here. And so we could see that that stack is there. Now, I'm going to hold down the Option key, Alt key if you're on Windows, drag that out. If I was to add a new element, I can choose where it gets added, and then that stack then grows. So this is not that far off from that text field where more text makes that text field grow when it's set to auto height, right? And we want other things in that stack to then move down. So once I mentioned, before, what you would have to do is you would have to move everything down. You have to create the space. You'd have to adjust the gap that exists between that manually, which could take a lot of time. But now when I select this auto layout frame, I have that benefit of being able to control that gap. Let's say I want to add some padding on the inside or the outside. I can add in padding. And actually, one thing you'll notice here, you can see that when I added that padding on the left and right, it didn't impact this. And the reason is its resizing doesn't match the rest. And we're going to talk about that in a moment, but I can easily option double click and it will now fit on the inside of that. So I'm going to reduce that padding and we're going to talk a little bit more about how this is going to work. All right. So that's a vertical layout stack. This is an example of a horizontal layout stack. And this is an example of a wrapped layout stack, which gives you something akin to a grid, but it's not quite a grid. And we'll explain what that means in a moment. So let's get into, once again, resizing in auto layout. What you need to think about is either the frame is impacting the contents, right? So the size of the frame is impacting the contents, or the contents is impacting the size of the frame. So what that means is it's either the width of the frame is changing based off of the width of the objects inside, or the width of the objects inside is being impacted by the width of the frame, right? So that is what resizing is fundamentally kind of breaking its way down to. So if I think about fixed sizing, right, that means that I have full control over the width and height of everything here, right? And like nobody cares the wiser, right? Nothing is being impacted by anything, right? It's anything goes. So I'm determining what the width and the height is of these objects, and there's nothing impacting anything. But fixed values are really important. I'm just going to hit undo a bunch here. Fixed values are going to be really important because something needs to hold that value, right? Either the width of your device, right? Or the width of a frame. Something needs to be determinant of that size. So if we take a look at hug, what hug does is it is determined on the contents. So here, if we take a look at this little diagram that I made, the outside frame is set to hug and the inside object is set to fixed. And what that means is as I grow this, the outside frame grows. Right? So let's walk that through an example. I'm just going to make this from scratch. So then that way y'all can get a better sense of it. So if I was to draw out of frame, I press the R key, I draw out a little rectangle, and I like to use just simple rectangles as a wireframe for my example of what I'm trying to accomplish, right? So I drew one, I'm going to hold down the option key, I'm going to drag another, I'm going to hold down the option key, I'm going to drag another, right? So I have three, let's say I have four objects, right? I'm going to make this one green. Now, with no auto layout set, if I go to move this down, right, I can't really do much of anything. If I expand the height of this, then I have to consider these and I have to move it down, and it's pretty manual. I'm going to hit undo. So instead, what I can do is I can select them all and I can press Shift A. So I just want to highlight over, where'd I had a shortcut. There we go. Create auto layout, Shift A, remove auto layout, Option Shift A, or Alt Shift A. So auto layout is just a property on the frame. Right now, there is no containing frame, right? There's nothing containing it. So in that absence, when I press Shift A, you'll notice over here in the layers panel, what I've just done is I've wrapped those rectangles that I added to the canvas inside of a frame. That frame is the auto layout frame. And I can just call this AL, right? Al, it's my Al frame. And the Al frame is going to turn on this panel over here. And it's basically telling me, how is this auto layout frame behaving? Right? So it's stacking these objects on the inside. I have a gap value, right? They're all spaced out by 20. There's no padding right now. I could put in some padding. I could say 24 padding and 24 padding. And you could see that there's space around it when I hover over, right? It's there. But the thing that's most important is this resizing panel right here. So it says width 443 and height 644, and there's a hug value on it. So when I click that little drop down, I could see that this is a fixed width. So the width of that frame is currently fixed. If I were to change it to hug, then it would hug and be determined based off of its contents. So what that the height, however, right, is set to hug. So that means that this container is going to grow based off of how many elements are inside. So I can select that frame. I'm going to just turn on my fill layer so we could just see that it's white. I can make it red. I can make it whatever. But by setting that background on that frame, and it's got those objects inside, and they're currently set to a vertical stack, if I increase the height, or if I want to move this one down, right, auto layout gives me the opportunity to do that very, very quickly. Right now, if I increase the width, I might like, oh, I just broke it. You know what? Why is that? And that's because there's another type of resizing that's taking place, and that is fill container. So fill container means that the content size is determined by the frame. So if hug is the frame size is determined by the content, fill container means the content size is determined by the frame. So it's either the outside that is being affected by the inside, or the inside that's being affected by the outside. So if I select this and its width is currently set to fixed, I can then set it to fill container, and there it is. Then you might be asking, well, why did we talk so much time with constraints? I'm going to take this card over here. I'm going to copy it. And let's bring it over here to our auto layout. So this is just a frame. In many respects, it could be made into, let's make that text a little smaller. There we go. So with many respects, this could be made into a component, but I could drop this inside, or I can, let's cut it, select the frame, hit paste, right? It's now inside of this layout. And if I was to set this to, let's say, fill container, right? When I grow that container, it will grow. Let's change its little border to black. There we go. So this is a frame that we made earlier. The frame had the image inside with constraints, top, bottom, left, right. We had the text in it that was set to bottom. The text itself, right? We didn't cover this, but we could change the text alignment as well to be aligned to the bottom. And so now within the auto layout frame, as this resizes, this frame is going to set to fill to the width of that container. Its height is currently fixed. So that means when I resize its height, it's going to grow the container. So it's all about what you're trying or intending to do with your content and how you begin to set it. So I'm getting asked a question. What are some auto layout rules we can follow before starting to design inside of a mobile screen frame? It all depends on what it is you're trying to design. So if I was to look back at the example over here, right? Over here, there's some instances where objects are going to move off screen because they're going to scroll left and right. So that is going to be a fixed width, right? Or it's an auto layout. It's an auto layout that has, its own thing. This resizing, right? When I resize that window, you're going to see that that's set to fill, right? So it's going to grow, right? Some of these other layers, they're all set to fill, so they kind of grow. I'm going to select that frame. I'm going to turn off clip content so you can see how this container here is not reacting to the frame, but these are, because it's being set to fill. And then its sub objects are also kind of filling to that spread. So once again, you'll notice by resizing that frame, the intent isn't to scale the frame, but to think about how objects respond to it. So this being the main container, right? You need to think about how those nested objects behave. So what I would say is, as you're building out your frame, begin to think about how it may kind of live within a frame. Think about the individual components that you're building and how they might grow. And what we refer to this as is like testing a component. So if I was to take this little card that I've created, I can make it into a component. And, then when I go into my assets, I can bring that component in, and I begin to test that component on how it may want to behave, that I may then use it later. So let's say if I'm going to add in a different image to the component, then I would update that text Apple, right? Now this component will also have those behaviors, right? Still kind of dependent based off of the first one, but I can then skin it and update it, and then it can begin to live. However, you might be changing certain things with how this all kind of works together. So it's a matter of what your intent is and what are you trying to do. Once again, fill container, all of these objects, when I look at the resizing over here, I can see that they're currently set to fill. Their height is fixed. So what that means is as I grow the parent's currently set to fixed. Now, if I change the parent, right? So this auto layout frame is the parent. And it's obvious here when I look at the layers panel as well. These are the children. This is the parent. When I change that instead to hug contents, Figma is going to tell me, it's going to be like, hey, something needs a width value, right? So if the outside is set to hug and the inside is set to fill, it can't work because it's looking for something to generate what is that value that we're looking for. So now if I look at the inside pieces, these have all now been set to width because Figma is like something needs to be a fixed value in order for this to work. All right. So that's where people are going to get kind of like caught up because they're going to expect things to just magically work, but you need to impart onto the interface how you wish for it to behave. And like I mentioned, sometimes it's helpful to think of those elements, like as individual elements. Right. So, like I said, very powerful to work with. If I was to, let's say, take this little component that I made, right now, I am setting a fixed width and height for it. So I can have more of these in a row and I'm ready to, have them exist within auto layout. I can select all of them, press Shift A. And as mentioned, if you don't have a frame, Figma is going to create a containing frame. So this might be my gallery row. And inside, each of these are all set to fixed. So they're all set to fixed. Now I'm going to click on the parent. The parent is currently set to hug. So that means that the children, right, are impacting how that parent resizes. And that's going to bring us to one other concept that we're going to cover here, and that's going to be alignment. So as I'm working here, the auto layout frame is going to keep the objects always arranged, right? So this is currently a horizontal layout. These objects inside are all fixed. I'm going to set all of those objects instead to fill. And once again, the width set to fixed for gallery row, because if they're all trying to fill and the container is trying to hug, there's nothing with an actual value, right? Something needs to respond. So now that this is set to fixed, right, they're kind of behaving to it. So other things that I can do is if I change this width, right, now we have like mixed values where this object has a fixed width, but this object is set to fill. So the thing that I want you to do is I want you to think about, wait, why isn't this working the way that I believe that it should, right? So as this gets wider, that one's always going to be the same, right? And it's just like, oh, let me check the resizing. Mig said, check the resizing. Oh, why isn't this behaving the way that I thought? Click right here, fill container. And now they're all filling to that container. I mentioned alignment. Sorry, I got a little off track. Alignment goes right here. So these objects inside of this auto layout container, you choose how they can be aligned within there. So oftentimes, you're used to seeing them maybe all the same height. But now the alignment is going to allow me to choose how are they within there. All right. So auto layout, you can get way deeper into auto layout. I do want to cover grid for the remainder of this session because we're focusing more on resizing. And the thing that I'm trying to impart is that resizing, understanding that concept of, is something have a specific user defined width and height? Is something having its width or height defined by its contents, or is the contents being defined by its parent? Let's go for grids. Oh, I love that. David, appreciate you. So let's talk about grids. So grid is currently in beta. And what that means is they're still changing certain things around with grid. I've covered a number of different grid tutorials. So some of you have probably seen my grid basics tutorial on YouTube. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. And this is going to be required reading too that I'm covering here because things have changed since that office hours. What grid allows you to do is, instead of just working within a single row or column, right, you get both row and a column. It's great for tabular data. If you think of a calendar, if you think of the, what is it? The app screen where we go, I'll show you over here. This isn't in the file, but, oh no, where did it go? Is my example not here? I thought it was. There it is. There's the example. This is like a simple wireframe of, like, the last page in like your Apple apps where they're all arranged as like these like little grid squares, right? So grid gives you the ability to organize that structure with much more intent. So to enable grid, I'm going to draw a frame and I'm going to show you the parts of grid where you have to pay the most attention. So I just drew out a frame. I got frame 2608836. Let's just rename that, be like, MIG's, oops. I'm just going to say, my first grid. I have that frame selected. I'm going to come over here to flow. It's going to be the last option there. When I choose that, you're going to see it creates these little cells. And when I click on this grid option, I can go in and choose how large I want that grid to be. And I can also open grid settings. And what grid settings allows you to do is have control over the resizing of your grid. I feel that many folks getting into grid right now are getting hung up on the grid resizing. So I want y'all to understand that there's going to be two types of grids. There's going to be a fixed grid and there's going to be a hug grid. For a while, Figma only had a fixed grid. And what that means is that when I select this frame right here, you'll notice that this is set to hug, right? And I'll even notice that the parent is set to hug. The thing that I want to highlight here is that this actually doesn't make a lot of sense because there's no contents. It's literally hugging nothing, right? And so that means that if I draw a rectangle, let's make that rectangle red, and I draw that rectangle inside, that rectangle is kind of shaping things up. And it might be confusing because you have these empty cells that don't have a value quite yet. So that could trip some people up. And the thing is I'm going to show y'all really quick how auto layout works. Like if I was to draw a frame and press auto layout with Shift A, I have an auto layout frame that's set to hug, but nothing. It's actually in a limbo state. So if I press rectangle, I draw a rectangle, now it'll hug, right? So when you draw out a frame and you first set it to auto layout, So if I was to draw a frame and I press Shift A, it lives temporarily in this little limbo state before I drop something in, because Figma's assuming you're going to drop something in. And I'm going to show you how to change and control all these properties in just a moment. So same thing here. If I was to draw a frame, set it to grid, and there's 4 objects there. Let's say you already had your 4 objects ready to go, right? You have your 4 objects, you drop it in, it's going to hug to it. So that might not be your intention. Your intention, and as I mentioned, some of these defaults may change, may shift. So you need to pay attention to that resizing. If I was to click on grid and I set a 5x5 grid, let's say I want to change it so that way my grid is fixed. I'm going to go right here. I'm going to select this first frame. These little dots that show up give you the column and the rows resizing, right? When I select that first column, I'm going to hold the Shift key and click the last column. I can click right here and then have them all set to fill. And I can click here and then have all those set to fill, right? And now it's going to set, I'm going to say my first grid. My microphone's in front of my keyboard. There we go. So now, right, we see that that grid is dependent on the width and the height. They are all given what are known as fractional units, right? The fractional unit tells the within the grid how much space to occupy, right? Well, notice over here on the right, they're all set to fill. These are the grid settings. So the reason that becomes helpful is, oh no, where'd my images go? Oh, I guess I got them over here. The fixed grid, right? Once again, I select that grid. I click on one of those frames. I look at the grid settings. All of the nested cells are all set to fill. This is going to allow me to make a bento box, right? So I can drag an image in. I can have the image span multiple columns. And this is going to be, if you follow many of my grid tutorials online that I released last summer, this is the kind of functionality that's going to allow you to easily kind of build that up. And once again, we need to think about the contents inside. So these objects as well are currently set to fill. So these images are set to fill. And what that means is I can now change my grid size and they'll grow and they'll flex. I can change the gap and they'll grow and they'll flex. I can add padding and they'll grow and they'll flex. So I can easily generate this bento, and I can even move objects around, right? I could kind of drag it, move it up or down, and based off of the alignment, right? So how is this aligned? This is currently being aligned on the left and the top. I want it to align to the bottom and the right. And so now that means that as I grow this, right, I can actually overlap other frames. And let's say I want to bring it to the front. You're like, Mig, but what about Z-index? How does Z-index work? I can just bring it right to the front, hitting the right bracket on my keyboard, right? And I can control it. So I can start to have more impact on this layout. So once again, this object too, I can like bring this over to the right. I can bring this down. And now you'll notice the alignment is going to be on the left and on the bottom, right? And this behaves the same way that grid and CSS is going to behave. And I can bring this to the front. And I can even take this little bird. I'm going to hit the right bracket key on my keyboard and bring that to the front. And that's going to give me so much control within this grid layout. So this is a fixed grid where the width and the height resizing of the grid is set to fixed. These currently, when I snap it inside, you'll see that it will then change to fill, right? When I break out of that fill, it changes it to fixed. So when you're modifying it on the canvas, you're also changing the resizing behavior of those objects. Let's bring that up to the right with the right bracket key, right? And so now I could have that control. And now this can be, this can be a component. This can sit within a website, right? And I can like lay that out. and I can determine how I want these objects and these images within there to react and grow. Now, you have to be mindful if you want something to have an aspect ratio lock. So I select that image, right? Aspect ratio lock. We talked about that with the image, right? One of those values needs to work. So here, right, I could set this aspect ratio on the image. It's being aligned to the bottom and the left. See, this is where everything that we talked about earlier kind of are now starting to make a bit more sense. I can say instead, hey, I want this to align to the top and left, and I want it to align to the top and left of that cell right there. And that's going to impact how it behaves when I resize. So here I can move that down and I can move that around. And if I wanted instead to fill, right, I could snap it to fill, and now it'll snap and it'll fill. I could bring this up to the top, just double click. Oh, don't want to double click there. Here we go. I want to make sure I got it inside of the grid and move that up. And you will see that with that aspect ratio, it's going to keep the aspect ratio of the image, but it's not going to keep that height, right? So when you're resizing, right, we're going to kind of go back, right? When you're resizing, you're not scaling, unless you know the whole grid itself. I can apply aspect ratio lock to that grid, and now as this grows and shrinks, it'll maintain that whole component, right? So if I wanted to make this like little bento component with my designs, I could easily make this, and within the layout of a like a mobile layout, you know, it'll always maintain that aspect ratio on that parent container. Okay. So when things aren't working, it's because you need to kind of explain to it how you want it to behave. Let's go even here. So right now, this is another fixed grid. I can easily drop that text in. I could drop this in. I could drop that in, right? I could put in these like text fields. And then if I want to rearrange, I could just grab and I could rearrange this. Oops. Sometimes too, if you kind of drag it down and you get these like extra rows, if you don't want them, you can move this up. You can select this row right here and press delete. So even here, this text, I could say I actually want it to align to the bottom, right? There it is, align to the bottom or align to the top. And then, you know, here I then have that layout. Now this layout too, it's going to change how the text resizes. So once again, thinking about how text resizes is going to be really important to how you begin to build this out, and how you're beginning to arrange this. So here, let's say I need my crabs text over there, my puffins text here, my seagulls text there, my crab text there. And then I can determine how I want this to behave. If I don't want it to resize in that way, I can turn on aspect ratio lock. It'll keep the aspect ratio, but I still then need to think about that text. And that is where hug can come in, right? So here now, if I think about this growing, but I need some of this text to push it down, I can select this row and I could say, hey, I actually want you to hug the contents of that row, right? And then as this grows, you'll see that the hug is growing up. Then I might be able to say, hey, I actually want this height to hug the contents. So now I'm thinking in two dimensions and I'm thinking about how I want this text to grow, where this text can now impact the height of that row and the container. I'll show you that one more time. So let's say, once again, I have this grid that I'm working with, right? By default, I may have set it as a grid that is all fill container, right? That the parent container is also is just set to hug. I'm sorry, not hug, fixed and fixed. There you go, fixed and fixed. So right now, this is a fixed grid. Oh, do I have to let me set them all up properly? There you go. So those are all going to be set to fill container, and these are all set to fill container. So a fixed grid is like this, where like all of these elements are inside, right? If I set these to fill just by snapping those to the edges, right, we'll see that those images kind of fill that space, right? That behavior just set them all to fill in 2 dimensions, right? But instead, right, I have this text and that text is variable and that text will grow. So I need to make some changes. I need to rethink some things. So now I can go in and I can set that to hug contents. So what that means is that as that text grows, it's going to grow. However, because it's growing and that parent is still set to fixed, it's not going to cause the container to grow. So if I want the container to respond to the contents, it needs to hug. We're going to go to height. We're going to set it to hug contents. We could see that it's going to change some things around to make this work a little bit better. And now you'll see that this is set to hug. And that means that as I have this text, I'm going to copy and paste that text in. It will now grow. So you're going to think about how is it that you want to behave. If the behavior isn't right, check the resizing and check your alignment. So once again, the way that a hug grid, and this is the default, is going to work is if like I have these 6 objects, right? I'm going to take my object. I created the grid. I'm just going to drop them in. It's going to hug and it's going to shrink to fill them, right? And by default, if you only drop one object in, it's going to do its best to hug around it, but it's kind of charged up with these like empty states, right? It's like, oh, okay, let me add another one. Oh, let me add another one. Let me add another one and another one and another one, right? So you need to think about what is it doing? Is it responding to the parent or is the parent responding to the child? And by default, that's the resizing. If you want to change it, if that's the case where you're just like, wait, no, I much prefer the other option, just click this little resizing resizing option right there, hold shift, and then you can just set those to fill and then click, hold shift, and then you're going to set those to fill. And that's going to then use fractional units. And you might be asking yourself too, Mig, you didn't really explain what a fractional unit is. A fractional unit is a concept. It's in a grid in CSS, and it's basically just saying like how much space should this occupy, right? So what I could do is I could say 2FR, and that's going to be almost like double the amount of space than what this is. So this is 1FR, and that's 2FR. If I increase that to 3FR, right, that's taking up 3 times the amount of space as this is. It's going to be a little bit more proportional. So this is going to help you if you're thinking about still having a kind of like a relative size for the objects. So as I change this, this is going to be 3x and this is going to be 1x, right? I could change that to 4, right? This is now 3x height and this is now 1x height. So conversely, I can set those FR values there. So it's how much of that fraction is being divvied out to that area in the grid. So it's a fun way to, or a very clever way, a functional way to work with the grid, much like you would in a responsive layout on the web. All right. So once again, hug is going to be entirely dependent on like the children. And so here you'll see this is set to fill and fill. The second that I begin to expand the height, you'll see that fill and a fixed values there. The second I grow that, I'll see that that is a fixed value. You'll always see a fixed value represented as its pixels. However, you'll see right here the pixel size as well as the resizing on any object right there on the canvas. So clicking on grid, I'll see that this is hug and hug. So you always need to be intentional about what it is that you have selected, as well as where is it getting its width and height from? Are you explicitly setting it with a fixed value, or is it determinate based off of something else, either the container or the contents. Show you one last thing before we get into questions. So right here, if you think about having like a table, right, I can set the table based off of, this width right here, and it'll grow the table. You need to think about what it is that you're trying to flex and work. All right, let's head on over to questions. Oh, how to create the orange lines really quick. Whenever you have like an object, if you press Shift M, you can draw an annotation, and to hide it, you press Shift Y, but Shift Y to turn them on and off. So that lets you see any annotation. The tool is down here, measurement and annotation. When you press Shift Y, it'll hide it. Shift Y, it'll show it. And it'll then also be visible in dev mode. With those lines as well, you could even just type in whatever you want. So I could say hug, or I can say, full height, or I could just say it's Jerry or Jay. There we go, Jerry. Right? You could type in whatever you want, or it could just be based. If I delete it, press delete, and I'd redraw the annotation, it's going to tell me what is that height at all times. As I resize it, let me hit escape, and then I resize it, it'll show me the value. All right, let's head on over to questions. Quick question. When we're clipping content, does that allow us to have an option for those components to scroll? Absolutely. So if we're clipping content, if let's say I have 1 object, 2 object, 3 object, 4 object, let me make them more visible. I put them inside of an auto layout frame. I press Shift A. So this is in a frame. Now, when I drag that width is now fixed, but these objects are still auto layout inside of that. Now, when I clip that content, right, there's other things that are there. So if I take this frame and I put it inside of another frame, and I select that, and when I go into prototyping, when I select this nested frame, I can set it to horizontal scrolling and the overflow to horizontal. So when I preview this with Shift space bar in like a prototype, it will allow me to scroll that. Take a look at some of my previous sessions on prototyping, and look for scroll prototyping, and that'll highlight it right there. So this right here is an instance where I may want that container width to be fixed, but the contents inside are still auto layout, right? They're still containing that gap, and they're kind of moving outside of that frame, because I can clip the content of that frame so it can then scroll on the inside. All right, cool. Next question. What is the use case of grids? There's tons of use case of grids. So within any sort of application, you can use grids for laying out like content for consistency. You can use grids for arranging icons, for making menus, here for just kind of having like a consistent navigation, or layout for like content. So even here, this is content cards that are made with grid, that allow like a portion of it to display an image that can still kind of grow responsively. I've used grid for sort of macro layouts of like entire web pages. If you want to keep like a bento, if you're making a calendar, right? Calendar is a key example of a grid. So each one of these cells is essentially represented by a text field for creating that calendar. So even here, if I wanted to set a manual height for like that grid row, I can control that much more easily. The reason that you use grid is that in the past, people would make a 2D array of auto layout, and that wasn't really like enough. So grid is actual functional containing system within CSS. It's like a structure that you then use to house your content, to not only be like flexible and responsive. So can I round the corners on all the images inside of a grid in one single action? Javier, you are my friend. I will walk you through exactly how to do that. Let's say I had all of these images in here, right? And I'm like, I want to round off the corners on all of those images inside of that grid. This grid is a containing frame, right? I have it selected. When I press enter, it selects all of the children, right? And that works in anything nested in Figma. When you press enter, it'll select the children. So now that I've selected the children, I go to corner radius and I could round off all the corners at the same time. So let's take a look at that. Let's hit undo. Let's hit undo. I'll show you that one more time. I select the containing grid. I press enter. All of the children are selected. Let's apply a corner radius. They're all modified at the same time. That parent-child relationship is really important. And so notice here, I can select this top frame layer, press enter, 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 right? All of those children are selected. I could keep going level in, and I'm selecting children, 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 all the way deep. Now, if I want to move my way out, shift enter, shift enter, shift enter, shift enter, and it's moving its way up back through all the parents. So I use this a lot, especially when working with auto layout. So let's say here, I press enter and I want all of these inside of the auto layout instead of being fixed, I want to set them to fill. Boom, now they're filled, right? Instead of fixed, set them to fill. Boom, now they're filled. So once again, I select the main frame, I press enter, it selects all the children. Now I can perform a batch action on those children. All right, one more question. When should I not use a grid? So the things that I'll say is that auto layout kind of assigns itself to Flexbox in CSS. Grid kind of aligns itself more with like CSS grid. I use grid to kind of just maintain consistency. I like using them I like them the most for fixed assets. Like I use grid for print, for social media assets, for laying out sort of macro elements. I think that you shouldn't use a grid if you really are looking for those rows to be flexible. So let's say if I have an auto layout object, let's do 1, 2, Command D, 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 D. I have a bunch of these. I select them. I press Shift A, right? And so you'll see the auto layout flow is currently set to horizontal. I'm going to change that instead to wrap, right? So here now, when I resize, I want those objects to grow down, right? So that's not a use case where I may use grid. And once again, the alignment factor, I can change the alignment to be center. So when they grow down, they grow and fill the center area, right? Or even if I wanted to align to the right, when I resize that down, they're aligning to the right. So let's say the sensor might be something that I may want. So when you have those elements, you don't necessarily want them to flex out, but you also want that container to grow in size. That's an instance where you may not use grid for responsiveness. However, the way that many folks use grid is at various breakpoints, they may assign a different kind of like column set grid. Sometimes you might, on a large device, you'll use like an 8-column grid. Then on a smaller device, you might use a 4-column grid. And so this is going to be kind of responding to everything, whereas the other one, you might be more breakpoint driven. So that's something we can probably cover in a later workshop. So once again, thank you all so much for joining today's workshop. Hopefully you found this helpful. We will be sending out the recording. So if you registered, you'll get a recording for this. We'll be sharing this out to YouTube in the coming week. So thank you so much. I really appreciate y'all. And as always, happy designing. Awesome. Yeah. Oh, I have one last question. When is auto width useful? Auto width is useful when you're making a button. So like if I was to just have some text and I just say, click here, right? And I press Shift A, that puts it inside of an auto layout frame. And then let's set that fill to like, a color. There you go. That's a super accessible color. And I round out those corners. Now this is set to auto width, right? This text field is set to auto width. And that means that as my button text grows, the container grows. So you're probably going to use auto width on a text field that's meant for a button versus auto height, because that's not going to grow in that same way. So auto width is going to be great for button elements or anything that's going to be row sort of driven, where you also want that row to then expand. So one last little tidbit for
You
y'all.
thought he was done. He is
Thought
never
I was
done.
done.
Y'all, happy Friday. So happy that you joined us here today. And definitely fill out that feedback form so we know how to be better for you in the future.